This episode of New Politics was released on the 21st of June, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wongal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to our audience and welcome to you, David.
Hello, Eddie. Good to be here. How are you going?
Well, I'm going very well and just wanted to outline what we've got coming up this week. We've got another big episode coming up, a few very, very big events in the Middle East. Not sure what Australia can do about the conflict between Iran and Israel, but I'm sure that we'll find a link there somewhere. Donald Trump didn't meet Anthony Albanese at the G7 meeting, and that was almost bigger news than a war between Iran and Israel. And we've also got details about the New South Wales Liberal Party, which is still in a bit of bother. But the question of the week is, should the Labor government invite the coalition to a national forum on economic reform? And we'll get onto all of those issues pretty soon. But David, would you invite the coalition to a national forum on economic reform?
Probably not, given their absolutely appalling record on managing the economy. I would prefer them to spend their time reforming and rebuilding themselves rather than come in with the same old ineptitude.
Oh, so the short answer is that if you were Prime Minister David Lewis, you would say no.
No, they're in the naughty corner.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The world got closer to the eve of destruction this week when Israel attacked Iran's nuclear facilities and missile sites and killed 224 people, mostly civilians, and then Iran retaliated with its own strikes on Israel and killed 24 Israelis. And part of my thinking is that both the Israel and US governments are looking for events to distract from various political issues that are going on within their respective countries. But whatever the case is, these are very high stakes and games to play with on an international level. This is a deepening confrontation between Iran, Israel and the United States. And David, there are just no winners in any of this. And as usual, we're seeing the usual level of duplicity from the West. And the basis for these attacks was to stop a nuclear enrichment program within Iran. And for 20 years, Israel has been saying that Iran is on the verge of developing the nuclear bomb. And it's not even close to the 90% of uranium enrichment that is needed to build a nuclear bomb. And generally, I'd prefer it if nobody had nuclear weapons, but no one has been able to explain why Israel has got a right to have nuclear weapons, but Iran doesn't, or why Iran has signed the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, whereas Israel hasn't, or why Iran allowed inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency, whereas Israel doesn't, or why Israel has violated so many United Nations Security Council resolutions on these issues. But I think the only thing that we can really hope for is that the right-wing fools in both the Israel and US governments are just looking for distractions, as I mentioned before, because they're going to be in for a big shock if they really think that they can force this so-called regime change in Iran using military measures, because Iran is not like Gaza, it's not like Syria, it's not like Lebanon, it's not like Iraq or Libya. And in all of those cases, both the US and Israel interfered within all of those countries. And Iran is a major power in the Middle East region with a population of 94 million people. It's got a lot of loosely affiliated allies in the region. And while there are many issues and problems within Iranian politics, and there's many people that despise the Iranian government, there's one thing that the Iranian population despises even more, and that's the United States and its threats to have some kind of military and political intervention.
It's Rocky and Bullwinkle with the magic hat, this time for sure. And you can't invade Iran. The world's biggest ever military force, the United States, tried it in the 80s, tried it in the 90s, they tried it in the 2000s. You can bomb it, sure, but no country has ever been successfully subjugated by air bombing alone. Those of you who've studied World War II will know the Battle of Britain. At some point, you need to put, I hate this cliche, the troops on the ground to consolidate the bombing. Now, the trouble with Iran and Iraq, as it happens, is that they're on plateaus. And the hardest military offense is against a hill. And you have a nation that is completely, basically, a hill. The other thing too, and this is the lesson of Gallipoli, if you have a motivated population, and it's the lesson of Vietnam, and it's the lesson of every failed incursion that the United States has done, if you have a motivated population, there's absolutely no way you can win. And so this notion that Israel and America are somehow going to stop Iran by invading them when they have an extremely poor chance, and their military analysts know this. There's apparently a lot of resistance within the Pentagon, not from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, but from his professional generals, to go in, being a total waste of personnel, total waste of equipment, and a total waste of time. Israel, of course, it's about Netanyahu staying out of jail, and a good war will keep him out of jail. But this isn't, say, Egypt, which is flat, or Libya, which is pretty much flat. It's a country built on a plateau. And, of course, the countries that are going to really suffer are places like Lebanon, who are in between and whose air spaces are now compromised. And this type of stuff affects business and trade between Lebanon and its trading partners.
Well, it seems to affect everyone as well, but my feeling is that the first act of war should be to avoid the war and to avoid any sort of military intervention at all. And it all gets down to defence of territory and defence of rockets being fired upon you and all those sort of things. But the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, did hold a media conference to say this.
Thanks very much for coming. I first wanted to respond to the strikes by Iran on Israel. The strikes by Iran are a dangerous escalation, and we condemn them fully. It is rightly condemned by all who seek a de-escalation and a ceasefire. Under international law, Israel has a right to defend itself against these attacks. And as you know, Australia always urges adherence to international law.
And I don't want to be a pedant, David, but it would have been more accurate for Penny Wong to say that Israel does have a right to defend itself from rockets from Iran that are in response to Iran defending itself from the rockets that were fired off by Israel in the first place and then sanctioned and promoted by the United States. But that might take a little while to explain and might involve too many diplomatic contortions. And I don't want to get into those sort of playground arguments about who laid the first punch and all that sort of stuff, because these sorts of situations are a lot more complicated than that. But this is unnecessary provocation. No one is talking about Iran's right to defend itself from this kind of provocation. And I feel that if people did talk about this more often and call out Israel's actions, as we've been doing for the past 18 months, if not longer, if there had been more talk about Palestinians also having a right to defend themselves, or Lebanon having a right to defend itself from the continuing aggression from the State of Israel, and condemn the actions of the Israel Defence Forces, if this had have happened before, these attacks on Iran would probably not be happening today.
Yeah. International law and international convention is pretty clear. It's never prevented wars permanently, but it's certainly delayed them, it's minimised them, it's stopped them in some cases. And it's generally only when you get bad actors in. Now, when we're talking about bad actors, I don't think we're talking about the Ayatollah Khomeini here. I think we can point to the other side. And as someone who's ostensibly on the other side, this is very upsetting. And they haven't started yet, but they'll start with the Iran is a theocracy and it's undemocratic. Sure. But if the people in Iran are happy with that, then we shouldn't interfere. And if the people in Iran aren't happy with that, unless they ask us for help, we shouldn't interfere. And that's true. Now, I don't think Khomeini and his cabinet have broken any international laws, as far as I can tell. And I'm not saying that I support them or that I would disagree with them 100% of the way. But it's none of our business, in a sense. If the Iranian people came to Australia and said, we've got to get rid of these people, will you help us? That's a different thing. But that hasn't happened either.
And I think it's also the way that this conflict is being portrayed by the West and by the media. And it seems to be following predictable patterns. Israel, the United States and every other country in the West, well, they have leaders, but Iran has got a regime. And in fact, any country that we don't like is a regime. Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Russia is a regime. Every Middle Eastern country is a regime. China, Cuba. Iraq actually had leaders in the 1980s when they were convenient to the United States, and they were a friend of the United States fighting a proxy war against Iran. But then they became a regime too, even though they still had exactly the same leader in Saddam Hussein. And he did everything that the West asked for, and then his country was attacked and invaded and he was executed. Now, I'm not suggesting that Saddam Hussein was an excellent leader or anything like that. He wasn't. He was a brutal dictator, but the point is that he was a friend of the United States when it was convenient. And just on the subject of Saddam Hussein, everyone seems to have forgotten the lies that were pushed through by George W. Bush and Tony Blair in the early 2000s that Iraq needed to be invaded because it had weapons of mass destruction. And this idea was supported by the Prime Minister at the time, John Howard. He spoke about it in Parliament in 2003. And over 200,000 civilians were killed in Iraq. And it was a hostile invasion by the United States and intervention in 2003. But the whole point about these weapons of mass destruction at that time is that it was a complete lie. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and now the same type of lies are being peddled around by the United States and by Israel, and the world is going to deliberately fall for the same lies this time around. And most of this is about the United States wanting to dominate the Middle East region. It's also punishment for the Shah of Iran being deposed in 1979, and he was a repressive lackey of the United States in Iran. It's punishment for the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and it's also punishment for Iran taking US hostages all those years ago. And the people of Iran do not want the US interfering in their country. That's what they did in 1979. They booted them out at the start of the Iranian Revolution. It's hard to see them accepting the United States' involvement in any form whatsoever almost 50 years later.
I mean, that point about language, and it's a regime.
Well, what are we, David? Are we a regime or are we leaders?
Now, I'll be fair, Australia, I suppose the closest we came to a regime was probably the Abbott to Morrison years. And you might argue the Fraser years. I think some of you out there might be old enough to remember Fraser's anti-union. And I guess we can even go back to the Lyons years and the Bruce years. But none of them really became regimes in the way that the word is implied when it's used. I think this type of the framing of language is becoming less effective as some people accept it. Oh, yeah, Iran is a regime and we've got to stop it. Some people do accept it, but I think there's a growing number of people who are thinking, hold on, what does the word regime mean? And surely a military-focused dictator sounds closer to somebody like Trump than it does to modern Iran, modern Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. All these places are pushed around as being regimes. A lot of South America.
Well, also countries go to war based on words as well. Words are the ammunition of war.
Yes, of course. To start the war, you've got to have your public on your side. And in World War II, World War I, our boys went over the top to face the dreaded Hun. Whereas I'm sure on the other side, it's these English barbarians came across and attacked our brave sons. It's part of the conduct, I won't say the rules, but the conduct of war, that you make your side sound a lot more positive and their side sound a lot more negative. But we're a little bit more literate these days. We're a little bit more cynical. I'm wondering if we're actually seeing the end of the Netanyahu regime, and another defeat in the Middle East might just finish him off.
Oh, well, I think that's highly plausible, because I think that all of these actions in Gaza, in Lebanon, Syria, and now in Iran, this is all about Benjamin Netanyahu trying to consolidate a splintered right-wing coalition in the lead up to the next election in Israel, which is due in October 2026. And as you alluded to before, it's also this process of keeping Benjamin Netanyahu out of jail. And if Israel is facing an election in October 2026, that's almost 15, 16 months away. That's a long time to keep going on with these forever wars. And Donald Trump is also deflecting from his own domestic problems. And to me, we've just got the wrong people in office at the wrong time. And my hope, which is how I started off this section, is that this essentially is all a planned distraction, that it's stupid, hard politics at play with missiles and guns and won't escalate into something more significant. And I just hope that I'm not wrong on that, but generally it's just very hard to predict how this is all going to proceed over the next couple of weeks. Because, you know, the other point is that Iran's got too many allies and alliances in the area and traditional supporters. India has got strong connections with Iran and wouldn't want any sort of US intervention in Iran. Iran is also part of Russia's Cold War field of influence. Iran is a big country, both in terms of physical size and population, 94 million people. And the US might try and do all of these things that it wants to do in that region, but to force this idea of regime change or to wanting or announcing that they want to kill the Iranian leadership, which is what Donald Trump threatened to do this week, well, it's just not going to work. And this is not a sign of sane, stable leadership. And I know that Donald Trump kept on talking about himself being a stable genius, but this is the opposite. This is madness. And as I suggested before, it's just very hard to predict what's going to be going on here. But I just hope that this is all setting themselves up as a planned distraction. It's not going to be much more than that, hopefully.
Yeah, we'd like to think that saner heads would prevail, but there's not a lot of sane heads in the centre of this. But hopefully France, Germany, Britain, European, South American countries, and even some African countries and other Middle Eastern countries might be able to talk things down. I mean, this takes us back to Australia too. Australia's got to change its relationship with the United States. I don't think it would be very wise for Australian troops to go back to the Middle East for another failed war. We've done it 4 or 5 times. It never ends well. Started in 1915 with Gallipoli, which even today a lot of people think must be a victory because we commemorate it every year. Well, no, it wasn't a victory. It was actually a humiliating defeat. A multi-nation army with 200,000 or 100,000, whatever it was, barely managed to scratch the surface of Turkey when they were supposed to march through it in 6 weeks or something. Same thing's going to happen.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
The President has been engaged, obviously, with the circumstances around Iran and Israel. It's perfectly understandable, the decision that he made. That meant that the meetings that were scheduled, not just with myself, but with India, Ukraine, including President Zelensky, Mexico, and other countries didn't go ahead today. But we're all mature about that. We understand the circumstances which are there, and we have agreed through our American friends that we'll reschedule the meeting.
The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was due to meet with the US President, Donald Trump, at the G7 meeting in Canada this week, but this meeting was cancelled when Trump decided to leave the G7 meeting early to deal with the crisis between Israel and Iran, even though essentially he's the one that instigated this. But Australia is not a part of the G7. It only has observer status. But the meeting with Trump was meant to be a time when Anthony Albanese was going to discuss the tariffs that the US has imposed on Australian imports, as well as the AUKUS arrangements, which the US is reviewing at the moment, as is Britain. So it makes sense to have a discussion about this. And The media had a total field day over this, with headlines outlining that the Prime Minister had been snubbed, he was left in the lurch or left in the dark, that he travelled across the world for a date with Trump, but then was stood up. And this is the quality of the media that we have in Australia. And I know that we complain about this all the time, but this is yet another example of that. And we just get the usual pro-conservative establishment analysis and uninformed analysis as well. And the media has successfully transitioned from their Peter Dutton says formula to Susan Lee says. Here's an ABC report during the week.
So, Tom, Susan Lee says this is a significant missed opportunity.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ros. The opposition has weighed in on this meeting that will no longer take place between the Prime Minister and Donald Trump, saying it is a missed opportunity. As you said there, this was a chance for Anthony Albanese to build a relationship with the President and to push the case on issues like AUKUS and on issues like trade as well. Here's a bit of what she had to say on this a little earlier.
It really is disappointing that the Prime Minister has not built the relationship with the US going all the way back to the 20th of January this year that needed to be in place right here and right now. It's just not appropriate that we can only rely on a meeting on the sidelines of an international summit.
And this is the usual stuff that we expect from the Liberal Party and from the media, but it's hardly Anthony Albanese's fault that Israel decided to attack Iran and Trump decided to cancel a meeting to discuss beef and imaginary submarines when he's got more important issues to deal with. And it's not as though if the meeting did go ahead that the tariffs would have been changed immediately and the AUKUS deal would have been cancelled or renegotiated based on this one meeting on the sidelines of a forum that Australia is not even a part of. It might have been an important process to have a meeting with the US president to build on that relationship, despite what you and I might think about Donald Trump and despite what a lot of other people think about Donald Trump. But he still is the US president. So that relationship has to be managed and developed and nurtured as well. But it's certainly not the big snub or stand-up that the media keeps wanting to push.
No, there's plenty to criticise the Prime Minister over, and there always is. They're either so intent on having him not succeed at anything, and he's had successes too. And if you've been a regular listener to our podcast, you'll know that, yes, there are some things that he's done that we've agreed with or have thought was good, and some things we've done that we thought was not good. And we try and hold the government to account.
And that's when we're accused of being Liberal Party supporters.
Or Greens. That's right. I've got to pay both my Greens and my Liberal Party membership this week. They're due. And my Teals, Simon Holmes at Court, you'll get my check later this week. Hold on for it. And my Labor Party membership as well. And the media should be critical when there's something to be critical about. And you can even be critical of the things that you agree with. Oh, they're doing this and that's good, but they could go further or they've gone too far or what have you. And that's okay. It means that they're not really doing their work if the best they can come up with is Donald Trump, who apparently was getting very frustrated with the other leaders. They were excluding him. They were talking down to him. They were talking at a level that he couldn't understand. And so when the Middle East started, he used the excuse to leave. That he cancelled a meeting with his, quote, good friend, end quote, Anthony Albanese, didn't bother him in the slightest. It certainly probably didn't even occur to him that he had a meeting, whereas a Bush or an Obama or a Biden or a Harris would have cancelled the meeting and rescheduled it or made it up in some way. Trump isn't built like that. He's just gone and it's done. It's more a criticism, I guess, of Trump. But because the parts of the Australian media are pro-Trump, it has to be, oh, look at this, he's humiliated Albanese. It's a cancelled meeting. It's not even a slap on the wrist. And again, I doubt Trump noticed that one of the consequences of leaving early was going to be he wouldn't get to meet with the Australian Prime Minister. Oh dear. Oh no.
Well, there's also this new portrayal of Anthony Albanese being stood up and that he's all alone over there. He's lurking in the shadows at the G7 meeting as if his only reason for being there was to meet with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And now that that's not happening, he's got nothing else to do. But there's other countries to meet with. There's diplomatic relationships to promote. What can the other countries do to counter the current actions of the United States? There's all of these discussions that he can have with other leaders. He can lobby other countries to allow Australia to become a permanent member of this group. And Anthony Albanese did meet with other US representatives and diplomats to discuss the tariffs and the AUKUS deal. So it's not a wasted trip just because he didn't meet up with Donald Trump. And I can guarantee you that this has all been built up as a big meeting with Donald Trump only because it didn't happen. And that helps push that message of it being a big missed opportunity, yet another factor to push an anti-Labor government message. And if it did end up happening, well, the significance of that meeting would have been downplayed, that it was no big deal and nothing happened. And I just feel that this is just another display of the duplicity that we usually get from the mainstream media.
Yeah, we've been seeing it for years. And part of the reason that I do the podcast here is because there's no alternative except for alternative media, or independent media. And because independent media is so small, the more of it there is, the better. And this is why it's important to support independent media, because at least it gives an alternative to a very substandard mainstream media. And again, not everybody in the mainstream media is bad. There's some very good journalists. There are some very good commentators. But it's underpinned by a mediocrity that the Australian people deserve better from. I've been looking at Frontline, the working dog show from early to mid-90s, and it's frighteningly still relevant in terms of its attitudes, in terms of its approaches, in terms of what is funny. It still works, which I'm sure appalls its creators. Same people who do Utopia, for those of you who are not sure what I'm doing, do chase it up. It's frighteningly still accurate. Some things have changed, but not by much. We could do week after week after week on how the media lets Australia down, and I suppose we do in many ways.
And I get the sense that the coalition is feeling a little bit of relevance deprivation, and as usual, they've not got much to say except for taking pot shots at Albanese for not having this meeting. Like, everything is hinging around this meeting with Donald Trump not going ahead. And Senator Alex Antic almost had a fit about all of this and was falling over himself trying to send through as much bile as possible about this non-meeting. Dave Sharma got into the act as well. And as Albanese said at the time, when he notified the media that the meeting had been cancelled, he said that we are mature enough to realise what's going on, that meetings sometimes get cancelled and they're rescheduled. That's what mature people do. And it's not his fault that Trump cancelled the one-on-one meeting with him. And the Liberal Party has been also pushing this idea that Albanese needs to be, or he should have been, more proactive about the relationship with Donald Trump without outlining what that could actually be. I think they've just said, you've got to pick up the telephone. But Australia's a low-ranking priority for the United States, and Albanese can't just pick up the phone and make demands about meeting the United States president. Australia is a low priority. We're not as important as we'd like to think we are. And sure, there's a lot of these actions from the Liberal Party that are just trying to create political mischief, because that's what an opposition should be doing, but it's just a waste of everyone's time and to behave in this sort of way.
Antic is one of the problems with the Liberal Party. These fringe figures shouldn't be anywhere near a mainstream party. And I'll be fair, if he was productive and useful, I'd probably think, we need these cases in Parliament. But he's not terribly productive and he's not terribly useful.
So we need better nutcases in Parliament.
We need a better style of nutcase.
Well, as Don Dunstan said, the former South Australian Premier, he said you need both wings to fly.
Yeah, and he's right. You want your parties to be in discussion. And for those people who are maybe less mainstream, they often have great ideas. Unfortunately, Antic wouldn't know an idea if it hit him over the head. I don't know why the party insists, except this obsession elements of the party have with getting further to the right, and it becomes so far right that it's not recognisable in modern Australia.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
And our audience gets a little bit bothered when we talk too much about the Liberal Party, but David, we're just helpful people. We just want to help them out as much as possible. But there was a big meeting of the Federal Executive Committee of the Liberal Party during the week, and they've decided to continue with the federal intervention of the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party, which continues to be a basket case and a complete mess. This is the New South Wales division that failed to nominate over 130 candidates in the New South Wales Council elections in 2024. They lost 4 seats in the recent federal election to only hold 12 of the 46 seats in New South Wales. It had a 4% swing against it at that election. It also lost the 2023 New South Wales state election. So things are not looking good for the New South Wales Liberal Party, but they've also decided to not just do one review, but 2 reviews. And the first review will be performed by Nick Minchin and Prue Goward, and maybe the second review will be to find out why those 2 people were chosen in the first place. And why get those 2 people to review the election result is hard to understand. It's just going to be more of the same. Nick Greiner, the former New South Wales Liberal Premier, is going to administer the New South Wales branch for another 8 months. But these are all yesterday's people, David, and part of the problems that were created in the first place. If the Liberal Party really wanted to address all the problems that resulted in their worst federal election loss in their history, well, I think that they should just be looking further afield to make things better. Going back to the future is just not going to work for them.
And when you say Nick Greiner is part of the problem, he's the one who privatises New South Wales, who gets us in a hideously expensive Olympic game and then strips away all the mechanisms that might help pay for this stuff. He sells off schools, he sells off hospitals, he sells off anything that wasn't nailed down. We now pay the highest power prices in New South Wales, in part thanks to Nick Greiner's approach to privatisation, which the Labor Party, now Neville Wren sort of starts this, but later Labor Party members, particularly Chris Minns, follow it on. Now, I'll be fair, Nick Greiner is, compared to some of his modern colleagues, quite moderate and was always socially moderate. Economically, though, and it's the economics in which the Liberal Party has lost all its credibility. It's no longer seen as the party of economic responsibility because we've lived through 30 or 40 years of what stripping state assets does. Hint, it's not good. What we need to really get down to brass tacks about is that the Liberal Party, and we've said this in our last couple of books, the Liberal Party is no longer relevant. It's a basket case in New South Wales. Now, they've actually got in a leader who might be able to pull them out in Mark Speakman. I'm not a big fan of Speakman, but I will acknowledge that his fiscally moderate and socially moderate approaches will be much better electorally for the Liberal Party than had they gone with another far-right incompetent like Dominic Perrottet was, or like Gladys Berejiklian was. Now, she was supposed to be a moderate, but the right controlled her to the point where it costs her badly. Mike Baird pretended to be a moderate, but he came from that wing of the party that...
the one that looks like moderates, but they're actually not.
And he wasn't terribly competent, and he jumps before he's pushed. Gladys was pushed, could never understand why she was pushed, and Perrottet lost the election. Now, I'll be fair to Perrottet, I think he knew that he was going to lose the election, although I don't think he realised his own hand in that downfall, that he was not terribly competent and his policies were not in step with what citizens of New South Wales believed was best for the state. It is right for the party to review itself, but I think it needs to have a massive purge of nearly everyone. It needs to get rid of the far right in the party, the religious right and the non-religious right, the economic radicals who think that we haven't sold off enough of New South Wales, that there's a perfectly good zoo that could be knocked down. Long Bay Jail is on prime, and all those schools which could be units, and we'll just funnel everyone into private schools except the students we don't want in private schools.
But I guess the idea is that at least they're recognising that they've got problems, but this is usually another problem with party election reviews. They're always done by insiders who can't think outside of the self-interests of the party. And I'm not dismissing the experience of those people who are involved, but they are insiders. And sometimes to get different perspectives, well, you need to get in people with different perspectives to tell you what they really think is going on. And it's not just the Liberal Party. The Labor Party does the same. They had the big reviews after the 2019 election loss, and that was performed by Jay Weatherill and Craig Emerson, and they were both former Labor politicians. And I didn't actually really see that much relationship between all of those recommendations from that review report in 2019 and Labor in opposition after 2019. They did choose better candidates and implement a small target process, which is what was recommended in that review. But that's about it. And they did end up winning the 2022 federal election. So I guess any review that results in an election win has got to be a good review. But these sort of things are always going to be about politics, and it's never about implementing a better democratic system or better engagement with the community or reforming the upper house in New South Wales. The Liberal Party will end up pretty much being the same with this process. What's best for the Liberal Party, and it's not going to change very much. And Nick Greiner, we talked about him before, and I don't want to be ageist, David, but it would be like bringing in Gough Whitlam to reform the Labor Party when he was in his 90s or something like that. You know, why would you do that? And generally there needs to be a rejuvenation and reinvention of the party, and maybe even a new party, which is what we've talked about in recent times. And this would be the time to do it. Like, you make these massive reforms or create a new party when a party is at its lowest ebb. The Liberal Party and the CLP and LNP made inroads into the Northern Territory and in Queensland at their recent territory and state elections, but they seriously went backwards at the 2025 election, the federal election, and they're likely to fall in Tasmania at their state election in a few weeks' time. And of course, you need to find out how and why it's all going wrong, but I just feel that this might not be the best way to do it.
I think Tasmania's got its own local issues. In this case, Tasmania is not where I would look at the failures of the party as a whole, because there's stuff going on down there that is unique to the circumstances in Tasmania at the moment. They've got the stadium thing and the whole AFL thing, and it's been badly handled. And I don't think that necessarily can teach us about what the problems in Western Australia or New South Wales might be. I think that they should get in maybe some older hands, but the thing is, Nick Greiner was a fairly electorally successful premier, there's no doubt in that, but he won his elections 30 years ago. Alan Stockdale was treasurer back in the Kennett government, and again, that's 30 and 40 years ago. This stuff can't be relevant. This would be like holding a reform in the 1980s and looking at World War II strategies. The way that I would do it is I'd have some experienced politicians, because experience is a valuable thing, no question. And I'll be fair, if you're going to get experience, Nick Greiner has a brain. Alan Stockdale has a brain. What they used them for is another thing altogether, but they're not incompetent and useless, unlike some of later ministers. But wouldn't you also speak to and even get in people who might have joined the party but didn't feel that it was welcome to them? Small business people, aspirational middle class people. You'd bring in migrants and the children of migrants and ask them, why aren't you joining the party? Now, you may find that some of these are irreconcilable. You know, well, I didn't join because I believe in public health and I believe in a welfare state, and okay, right, next. But you'd bring in people who, under normal circumstances, or under not normal circumstances, but under any reasonable circumstance, would be members of the party. And you'd look at why they're not joining and why they're not voting for them. And I think here is where you'll find party reform. People probably aren't joining parties for reasons that are philosophical and political motives aside. We don't join committees like that anymore. We're not out 6 nights a week doing our social, but we are spending a lot of time online. So perhaps we meet once a month in person, and the rest of the time it's email and WhatsApp chats and getting the work of the party done like that. And I know that there are those of you out there saying, we're doing this, but much more so, and making it obvious that these types of things can fit around your life. Maybe we stop thinking about in terms of branch divisions, but state divisions, that we have large meetings. I don't know. I haven't been involved in a party for many, many, many years. But my point is that to bring in people who were successful 30 years ago, sure, those voices are important. but they're not the only voices. Why not look at voices who could be part of the party's future and who could show the party where to go? Of course, the other thing is that you get into the vested interest. A lot of this stuff will require the purging of positions and people who have worked very hard, either ethically or unethically, to get where they are and who don't want to give it up. And this is true of all parties. Maybe it's best just to destroy the whole thing and start to rebuild. And for the Liberal Party, that will mean not being in government for another couple of terms. But they're not going to be in government for another couple of terms anyway. And the longer they delay that reform, the longer the terms that they won't be in Parliament will become.
The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, addressed the National Press Club during the week, and the topic of discussion was bold reform. And here's what he had to say.
There's an appetite to be bold and ambitious. What I tried to do in my contribution before is to run through all of the ways that we feel there is already an ambitious productivity agenda underway. We've already made a lot of progress on the budget. We've made progress in making our economy more resilient. But this is all about testing the country's reform appetite. And I don't see it in personal terms, but I am personally willing to grasp the nettle, to use an old saying. I am prepared to do my bit. The government is prepared to do its bit. And what we'll find out in the course of the next few months is whether everyone is prepared to do their bit as well.
And this will be a part of the economic reform roundtable that Anthony Albanese mentioned last week when he addressed the National Press Club, and we're still not sure what these reforms will be. I guess we'll find out more about it later on. But the idea is to bring together government, business leaders, the union movement and community members to build a broad consensus of the reforms that are needed at this stage economically. And there was a big push from the media at this National Press Club presentation about Jim Chalmers inviting the coalition to this economic reform roundtable. But why he'd want to do this is very unclear. The coalition would just be there as the wreckers, try to hijack everything, keep talking about nuclear energy or everything's gone woke, and that would be the end of this conference. And this is not normal protocol. The opposition is the opposition. They're there for a particular reason because they lost the last election and they lost the election before. It's not a part of the government. When Scott Morrison created the COVID Commission a few years ago, and that was a time of national emergency, he didn't include any members of the Labor opposition at the time. And if the Liberal Party could behave themselves and stop taking political opportunities at every opportunity, you might think about inviting them. But at this stage, I wouldn't even invite them anyway, even if they did behave. But at this stage, it's probably best to leave them out.
Yeah, I would let them concentrate on their own reform. And I'd say, look, the Liberal Party needs to focus on their own reforms. And maybe this is why Chalmers has invited them. If they're doing this, they can't be getting themselves into an electable position. When Morrison excluded Labor from the COVID Commission, that was an act of political nastiness. And I suspect that the Labor Party doesn't want to be seen to be doing that. But you could say, look, it's not about that. When they're in a position to be back, we will happily listen to their opinions. But at the moment, it's more important for them to focus on rebuilding the party so we can have a decent opposition that holds us to account. And the media is not going to buy that, but they never will. The media, the mass media, the mainstream media at least, is never going to buy that. But it's partly time that the Labor Party stops worrying about what the mainstream media says. And by mainstream media too, I mean the little watched Sky news programs, the little read Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun and Courier Mail. They need to stop worrying about the headlines and the bylines and start worrying about their own things. Now, Jim Chalmers has the brain to be able to reform, and he has the ability to be able to reform in real and significant ways. But if he's held back by fear, and it might not be him being held back, it may be the people around him who are holding him back, this benefits nobody. We're in a time where we need bold, constructive reform that advantages everyone in the country, not just the few. And I hope he's brave enough and determined enough to do it.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.